Welcome, ghouls, ghosts, and mere mortals to the Hidden Creek Manor. Now, this episode is going to be a little bit different than most of our episodes. Normally we go over things that we use in our haunt, but in this episode, we're going to get into something that is not being used in our haunt at all. We're going to go over how to build a cobblestone wall, but not just any cobblestone wall, this cobblestone wall. You see, whenever I decided to start this YouTube channel, I knew I wanted to have a cobblestone wall background to look kind of like a spooky castle. So when I built this wall, I went ahead and filmed myself, so that way I could use it in a future episode. So here we are, in the future. So let's go back in time and go over how we built this. First, let's go over the materials that I used for this project. I used one 4x8 piece of 1-inch insulation foam, and then one 4x8 piece of 2-inch insulation foam. I used 2 cans of spray foam, a bag of mortar mix and some exterior latex paint, 4 cans of spray paint, and then some green, brown, black, and white acrylic craft paint. So first thing I did was I took my 2-inch piece of foam and started mapping out how I wanted my cobblestones to look. Now for this project, I wanted it to be a more organic look. I didn't want to have a structured feel to it, so I just kind of played around with it and made all different shapes and sizes of cobblestones on here. But if you wanted to take a different approach, you could structure that however you like. Now for the window, I didn't want to have a perfectly symmetrical window. I wanted it to be a little bit more creative and spooky. So I did kind of measure out the general size of what I wanted, but after measuring that out, I just made the window by hand. I didn't have a perfect arch, the stones weren't perfect, but that really was the look that I was going for, and I was happy with the end results. So now that I mapped out all the cobblestones, it's time to start cutting them. I decided to use my hot knife just because it's going to create a lot less mess, but you can use all kinds of tools, whether it be a hot knife, a saw, a hot wire, even a kitchen knife. But like I said, that hot knife, it just cuts right through it like butter. You don't have a bunch of shavings, and it's just fun to use. Unfortunately though, after the first row or two of cobblestones, my hot knife quit working. So I had to switch over to my saw, which meant I was going to have a huge mess to clean up afterwards. I mean, here I am vacuuming my back deck. I mean, how often do you take your vacuum out and vacuum your back deck? Probably not very often. But there were foam shavings everywhere. Now that we've got the cobblestones cut out, it's time to start shaping them. Now this is also going to be quite messy. I like to lay a tarp down, that way it's much easier to clean up all those foam shavings. I grabbed my rasp and I started working with the foam. I would kind of start at the top and work my way out, shaving off the corners and trying to get rid of that kind of 90-degree angle that you get from just the top of the foam and the side of the foam. I wanted it to look more realistic, like actual rocks. So I just wanted to make sure it had a nice curve to it. Now this step can be quite time consuming. I had over 130 different cobblestones that I needed to sculpt. but I did want it to have more of that organic feel. So I went ahead and took my time. I made sure to get it right, gave the rocks some variety, so that way they didn't all look the same. And then after shaping all those cobblestones, it was time to start working on the window frame. So first thing I did was got my saw back out again and started cutting the larger pieces of foam away, so I'd have my nice frame. Once I got those larger pieces out of the way, then I decided to do the details with my smaller hot knife. It definitely would not have been good to cut through with the cobblestones, but for a small job like this, just to kind of do those tiny details, it worked out pretty well. And once I was happy with the details around the bricks on the window, I decided to go ahead and cut out the middle part of the window. And once again, I used my saw for this, so there was even more foam that I got to clean up. So now that I have my window frame ready to go, I still wanted to give it additional details between the bricks on the window. So I got my Dremel tool out and started just carving out those details. I tried to follow the lines on the bricks in the middle, and as I got to the ends, I would spread out the opening with my Dremel tool to give it more of a realistic look, like these rocks have been placed naturally together. So earlier in the video when I was talking about the supplies that I used, I mentioned that I used a 4x8 piece of insulation foam that was 2 inches. That was a last minute decision that I made at the hardware store. My original plan was to get a 1-inch piece. Once I started laying out my rocks though, I realized that 2 inches was probably not the best idea. I probably should have stuck with that 1-inch piece of foam. So I decided to cut them in half. Now, I actually filmed the first few seconds of me cutting them in half, but unfortunately my camera battery died. And it's probably good that I didn't get that on film because it was really hard to find a safe way to cut these small cobblestones. And at Hidden Creek Manor, safety's first. So it's probably best that I don't show a video of me not being the safest with the saw cutting small pieces of foam in half. So in hindsight, I probably would have bought a 1-inch piece of foam, but it works out because now I've got a bunch of cobblestones that I can use in the future. Now, when I did cut them in half, I wanted to make sure that it did have more of an organic feel once again. So I did not cut them perfectly in half. I just kind of eyeballed it from cobblestone to cobblestone. So that way, when I lay them out, they will have an uneven texture. So the next step in the process is to lay out the cobblestones in a pattern that you like. Originally, I tried to stick with the pattern that I drew onto that 2-inch piece of foam. After a while, that just kind of didn't happen. It just didn't work out. I was putting them in the wrong place. Some of them are upside down. So I ended up having to just scrap that idea and just lay them out as I went along and kind of figure it out. But once you have your cobblestones in place in a pattern that fits for you, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and glue them down. Now, I used Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks spray foam, and the reason I like that spray foam is that it adheres to the foam, it doesn't melt it or anything like that, and it does a really good job holding it all together. And we're going to glue it down to the 1-inch piece of 4x8 styrofoam. And as you're going through this, just keep in mind, you got to be quick. When you're using that spray foam, it will leak out of the tip, even if you're not spraying it. So just as you're going through this process, be as fast as you can. And then once you've gotten all of your cobblestones in place where they need to be, I suggest putting some type of weight over the cobblestones just to make sure that they kind of stay put as that foam expands. You don't want the rocks to come up. So I took a couple tables and put it across mine, but anything that you have that has a little bit of weight just to hold them down really goes a long way. So now that our cobblestones are in place, the foam is dried, it's time to start painting. Now you don't want to use spray paint directly on your foam, it can melt it. So you want to have some type of base layer first. And for that, I'm making my own kind of monster mud concoction using exterior latex paint and mortar mix. You could also use Drylock for this, but the mortar mix and exterior paint is cheaper than buying Drylock, and I'll use my Drylock in other projects, so I decided to make my own mixture. And for me, I like to have it about as thick as a cake batter. I don't want it to drip off my brush when I pull my brush out. So I kind of eyeballed it. I didn't do this with an exact measurement. I just would pour some paint in, pour some mortar mix, stir it up. If I needed more paint, I would add more paint or more mix, of course. So I would put that in. And then once I got to the consistency that I wanted, it was time to start painting the rock faces. Now, the reason I'm using a combination of both paint and mortar is because it does give it a textured look and feel. And with these rocks, with them being made out of foam and kind of having a flat surface, I wanted to give them more texture. So that's why I wanted it to be kind of that cake batter consistency, because I wanted to make sure that I can fill in the gaps and cracks and really, like I said, give those rocks a extra bit of texture. And as I was painting these, I would go back over each rock after I painted it. I kind of pat it with my brush just to make sure that we get rid of any extra brush strokes. And once again, give it more of that realistic look. So now that I've painted the rock faces, it's time to start getting into the gaps and cracks in between them. Now, for this step, I decided to use less of the mortar mix, so really more of a runny pancake batter consistency in some areas. There were even times where I just went straight acrylic paint. I didn't even have any of the mortar mix in there. And you really just want to get as much covered as you can, so that way when you do add the spray paint, it's not going to eat away at the foam. If you don't get every single bit of foam, it's not going to be the end of the world. But like I said, you want to get as much of this as you can, so when you do get to the spray paint, it doesn't start eating away at your foam. So now that we've covered all the rocks and all the gaps and everything in the base layer of paint, it's time to start spray painting it. I'm using a matte dark gray paint, and I ended up going through 4 cans of spray paint to cover this entire thing. And you just really want to make sure that you get every single thing covered. You want to keep the spray paint can a few inches away so you're not getting splotches of paint as you go through it. Even the youngest resident of the Hidden Creek Manor decided to help out with this process. So now that we have our layer of gray spray paint covering the entire thing, I wanted to give the gaps and cracks between the rocks a darker look to them, so that way it really makes the rocks pop out and really you'll be able to see the difference between the rock and the background. So I mixed up some black acrylic paint with some water, and then I just started spraying in between the rocks. Now I did keep a rag handy just in case I get too much paint on some of the rocks as I'm spraying between them. But what I would do is I would spray a bunch of spots, and then I would get out my brush and then just spread that around. And the reason I wanted to do kind of a mix of black paint and water is I didn't want it to be completely black. I wanted it to kind of have a dark gray look to it, kind of an aged look to it. I didn't want it to be perfectly even. So by doing the spray with acrylic and water, once that dries, it is going to give it a nice dark gray look, and it's going to be more of a natural look like you expect to see in a cobblestone wall. Now we can get into the fun stuff. The previous stages were pretty grueling, having to cut foam and use the rasp and shape the rocks and this and that, and it's all still green. It doesn't look like a cobblestone wall. The acrylic paint was a pain to get in between the rocks, but now's the fun part. Now it's when it starts to come together. Now it's when it starts to really look like a cobblestone wall. Now we could stop here now that we've gotten that dark look behind the cobblestones, but it still looks a little bit too new, not quite realistic enough. I wanted to have more of an aged look to it, like it's been around for years. So once again, I mixed some black paint with some water in the spray bottle, and I just started spraying all the rocks with this mixture of paint and water. And I'll just kind of let it sit on the rocks and soak in and create these kind of variations in color. Now, if I found that there was too much black at times, or if I wanted to look more of like there's been water dripping down the walls, sometimes I would take the rag and just kind of lightly brush over it just to give it some variations and make it look almost like water's been dripping down on the rocks over the years. I also like to pat down any very obvious lines of paint just because it does make it look a little bit odd. So I really wanted to have more of an organic feel. So if you notice, I just kind of went over those lines and just lightly covered them up with those splotching of the damp rag, just to make sure that they don't have those very prominent lines from the water. Now I was going to do a time lapse of me going through this process, but it was very hot and muggy outside, and I brought my camera from the nice, cool, air-conditioned house directly outside. I set it up, went to film myself, and then my camera lens got fogged over. So unfortunately, all you get is this kind of foggy view of me as I start the process. But let's move on to the next step. So once the black paint has dried, I decided to then go over the rocks again with a mixture of brown paint and water. And when I added the brown paint with the water, I didn't want to spray every single rock as heavily as I did with the black. I wanted to give it more variation, so I gave some rocks more brown paint than others. Some rocks didn't even get any brown paint at all, just to make sure that it does look more realistic. Like, all of these rocks are different. They could have come from different places. They're different types of rocks. That's the look that we're going for. And then after the brown coat, I decided to go over it again with some green. And I mixed a little bit of brown paint in with the green because just green by itself is too green. And same concept here. I wanted to give it variation. I wanted to give it kind of a old dungeon look where it's just kind of looks like water's been dripping down these walls for years. So I did let it drip down the rocks quite a bit. Once again, I had my rag in case I wanted to stop any real obvious water drips. And I really wanted to put more emphasis on the windowsill as well, making sure to get in between the cracks of the rocks, because with it being an open window, moisture would be coming in there anyway. So I wanted to have that realistic look. Now that we've got the rocks where we want them, I just wanted to add a few extra details. So first I mixed in some brown and green paint, mixed them together, and decided to do some dry brushing around the edges of some of the rocks to give it more of a moldy look, like there's mold actually growing on the rocks. Now at first it seemed like it was a bit much, a little bit too green, so I kind of started watering it down a little bit and then trying to spread it out as much as I could. But I found after a while, it worked much better with using a dry brush technique, where I just kind of lightly brushed downward with some of the brown and green paint mixed, and that would give it more of a look where water's been dripping down the rocks. And then I would also go around the edges of some of the rocks, whether it be the top edge or the bottom edge, or even both, with some of the green and brown mixture as well, just to kind of give it, like I said, more of that dingy, dirty, dungeon type look. Once again, I put more emphasis on the window. I really wanted to have a lot of green on there because, like I said before, it's the window, so chances are rain would have come through that window. It probably would have caused extra moisture, so there would have been more of that green look around the window. So I really wanted to go a little bit more extra with the green around the windowsill. And then the final step was I added just a little bit of very light gray to some of the rocks. Now I mixed a little bit of black paint with some white paint, and then I just dry brushed it. And once again, I would vary from rock to rock as how much of this I use, because I wanted it to have more of a natural look. So some rocks would have more gray than others, but I really just wanted to have just a little tiny bit of white on my brush and just barely brush over the rocks just to kind of get some highlights on there and just to give it some variation. So now that we've added all the details, let's take a look at the final results.
Perfect.
Now, one of the reasons I like to make these videos is to not only show you guys how to build these things, but also to share my mistakes. So that way you guys don't make the same mistakes. So first off, I would have bought 2 pieces of 1-inch foam, not a 2-inch foam and a 1-inch. I still got a bunch of extra cobblestones that I can use on other projects, so I'm not too upset about it, but it did add an extra step, and also 1-inch foam's cheaper. Secondly, I would have probably painted the 1-inch piece of foam before I started putting the cobblestones on there. It turned out to be a bit of a headache trying to paint in between the cracks of the rocks, and there were certain areas I couldn't get to. It just would have been a lot easier had I just painted that 1-inch base layer of foam first and then put the rocks on it afterwards. Additionally, I probably would have just painted the rocks individually as well. I probably just would have laid them out on a tarp and did a nice coat of spray paint over those just to make sure that, once again, it's just easier in the long run. So that's how I built this cobblestone wall. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay up to date and notified of everything that we're doing here at the Hidden Creek Manor, and we will see you in the next video. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. As a reward for sticking around, you may now watch one of these 2 videos. The choice is yours, but choose wisely.